Let's talk about outsourcing. When I started in the video game industry in 1997, outsourcing was pretty uncommon. You saw some outsourcing done for cinematics, and you were starting to see the growth of art outsourcing. But over the years, the amount of things that have been outsourced has increased dramatically. From a studio perspective, there are certainly advantages and disadvantages to outsourcing. If you have existing partners, traditional asset-based outsourcing allows you to ramp up and down your team size relatively quickly. If you reach a point in the game where you suddenly need 97,000 additional hats, you can add a bunch of external artists to create those hats very quickly. And then once you have those hats, then you no longer need the services of the outsourcers, and they're able to go off and work on other things. Ultimately, what you're doing with outsourcing is you are removing the burden of hiring and firing from within the studio, and you are putting it onto an external company to deal with. Additionally, often you will outsource to lower cost areas. The average salary in China or in Eastern Europe is significantly lower than most of the places in North America. So again, if you're able to, you can dramatically decrease your average cost per person unit by moving some of this work into lower cost places. What we've seen more recently is a movement from asset-based outsourcing. I'm going to pay you X number of dollars to make me a hat, to something that looks a lot more like remote employees, where I'm going to pay a monthly fee, essentially a salary, to have X number of artists or whatever on staff in a different location within an outsourcing company. You're starting to see more and more what is called Codev, which are outsourcing teams that are nearly complete game studios in their own right. And they're able to integrate into existing teams much more deeply. They might be responsible for owning incredibly large parts of your game. Maybe they would own the entire multiplayer mode. Or they might integrate more into the intricacies of the team and work almost as if they are direct parts of your team. Typically, Codev teams are going to be focused on one engine or a small number of engines. So you're going to go to a Codev team that works on Unreal. The benefit of a Codev team is they're largely turnkey, meaning you can sign that contract and they're ready to start adding value the next day because they already know the engine that you're working with. They're ready to go. They may be in a low-cost area. They might be in Eastern Europe. They might be in China. But in a lot of cases, they're actually not. In a lot of cases, these are small game studios that do Codev in order to keep themselves afloat as they try to build their own games. The consequence of that often is that they are usually going to be significantly more expensive than the asset-level outsourcers. Usually 2, 3, even more times as expensive. In extreme cases, you have Codev partners that are hyper-focused on a specific kind of thing. There are a couple of Codev partners out there who are very much focused on performance. So you bring them in as a Codev to help you drag your performance out of the gutter. And they might charge 10 times as much as that 3D arts outsourcer that you were hiring before. If you need this very specific skill set, you might decide that they are worth it, but they can get really expensive really quickly. And in that case, what you're really paying for is people that are ready to go right now who have a very specialized skill set that you may or may not have. You certainly don't have enough of. In the case of typical asset level outsourcing, what you're paying for is capacity. In the case of Codev, especially specialized Codev, is you're paying for specialized skills. You're paying for a very small subset of skill. At the moment, we're seeing Unreal rise again as the predominant video game engine in use. It never really went away, but a generation ago, for a while, it was 80% of video games, it seems. And it seems like we may be headed back, at least for a time, into a similar place. Unreal can be difficult for teams to optimize. If you dig in on the complaints on a lot of PC ports of games built with Unreal, a lot of times those complaints come down to a failure to adequately optimize them. Because Unreal can be tricky. Unreal can be deceptive in terms of its performance. And it can take a very specialized set of skills to get it working the way you want it to. As a result, I think we may see a dramatic rise in these performance-focused Codev partners. For the most part, having part of your team built out of people in other countries, people that work for entirely different companies, is usually not a benefit. But it does have a couple of advantages. If you look at some of the studios that do very heavy outsourcing, if you look at their credits, you often see a very small core team. So there is a benefit there if you are able to keep that team unified, self-contained, and able to build the core of the game and then spread the creation of the rest of the game across the entire globe. The unity and focus that comes from keeping that central team really small can be beneficial. Additionally, in a lot of cases, when you are going to do outsourcing, you are going to a single organization and you are having them do one thing. Now, in the past, that one thing would have been make a bunch of hats. Now it might be that, or it might be building the zombie survival mode for our shooter. But in either case, because that one location, that one outsourcing partner is doing one thing, you are actually often able to hyper narrow your communication channel down between individuals on the core dev team and the outsourcing partner. Whereas what often happens within a dev team is those communication channels get all intermeshed. You end up with that n squared number of communication channels. Even if maybe these two people didn't really need to communicate with each other, they maybe are. But now because they are in a different time zone, in a different country, working for a different company, the channels are more formalized. There's probably a single or very small number of contact points within the outsourcer, and you're going to restrict the number of people on your side that are communicating with them as well. The end result, if it's working well, is you're almost able to treat that outsourcer as if they're one incredibly productive dev. They are a dev that makes hats. They just make hats 10 times faster than any other artist can because there are 15, 20 people making hats. Or they are a designer making your zombie survival mode, but they're also doing all of the tech work and art as well. So that can really collapse down your communication channels. It can really simplify your structure. Sometimes you don't want that simple of a structure. Sometimes you really want your combat designer talking to the combat designer on the zombie survival mode so that you don't have a discordance between the two modes. And by having those channels so hyper formalized, you're not really able to develop that relationship. But most cases, for things that you are able to successfully outsource, that encapsulation is a benefit to the individual devs. Additionally, often the things you choose to outsource are the things that people aren't super excited about doing. Your 3D artists probably don't want to make 75 different chairs. So going to an outsourcing partner to make 50, 60, 70 of those allows your internal devs to work on things they're more interested in. That's not always the case. Sometimes the most easily outsourced things are the most interesting ones. But in a lot of cases, the things that you're most easily able to outsource are also the things that your devs are going to have the most interest in not having to do. So what sort of things can you outsource? The TLDR of that is you can outsource things that you can fully explain. If we are doing asset-based or delivery-based outsourcing, we need to be able to very clearly articulate what success looks like for the outsourcing. If we are saying, make us some hats, we are typically going to provide concept art for the hats we want made. And when we decide if they were successful or not, we are going to compare the 3D model that they made to the piece of concept art and say, yeah, these are the same, and therefore you have successfully delivered what we hired you to do. When we start to outsource programming, it becomes more difficult. But again, we are going to have a tech document or a feature list or something that indicates what the work they're supposed to be working on is supposed to look like, and then we can measure the deliverable against that list and decide whether or not they have successfully delivered what they're being paid for. And often, payment is contingent on approval of the delivered assets. One of the reasons why outsourcing of design hasn't really happened as much is because often that success document, that requirement document, that document that's ultimately going to be used to decide if they've succeeded in the task or not, is non-existent or really vague or hard to pin down to the point where we are able to hand something to another person with limited communication and expect some success of delivery back. Often, design is very iterative. We think we want two-handed weapons to cut people in half, but then as we implement that, we realize that that's overbalanced, and we end up doing something else where we put in cleave or where we abandon our original design because as we enter playtesting, as the features bounce off of each other, we realize that our original design isn't adequate. That's good, and that's a very tried and true form of development. But when you are working with outsourcers, that's highly problematic. Because in a delivery-based contract, they're getting paid for doing what the original plan was. In order to get them to pivot, in order to even have the feedback to allow you to pivot, you need a different structure. So as a result, asset level design outsourcing has been pretty limited because of that inability or semi-inability to adequately articulate the deliverables. When you are doing larger feature level outsourcing, ideally it looks pretty much the same. You have a document that says that for the zombie survival mode, it needs to have zombies, each match needs to take this long, it should have this many players, and then you can measure delivery against that design document. You're going to get more drift compared to asset level outsourcing because you can't provide a complete measure of what you really want. You are going to be a little bit more vague, but it is possible for features to draw a pretty big box and expect delivery within that box somewhere. It may not be exactly what you would have done if you had done it yourself, but you can still draw the constraints tightly enough to get something that you are going to be happy with. And maybe we're stumbling into the way to be successful with feature level, asset level, delivery based outsourcing. The trick ultimately is to have an overlap between the specificity of your deliverable and the generality of what you're willing to accept. If all you want is 57 hats and you don't care about those hats at all, you don't even care what art style they're in, it's pretty easy to find success with an outsourcer because you can just say, make me some hats, and they will throw a bunch of things back at you. And if all of those are good, then great. On the flip side, if you are able to say, make me this list of 47 hats, here are specifications about poly counts, about exactly how big it needs to be. Here's where their ears are going to be. You need to leave space for those. It needs to follow this art style. Here's a bunch of concept art you need to follow. Again, you are probably going to find success. because the outsourcer is going to follow your instructions. And when they don't follow the instructions, you have something very specific that you provided them to point to and say, no, you have deviated from the art style, see, or no, you've put too many polygons in this hat, or no, you forgot to leave space for the ears. If you can actually make those two things overlap a lot, it's going to be even easier for you to succeed. If you provide very clear specifications about what your hats need to look like, specifications around art styles, specifications around the requirements from a technical perspective, give them that concept art, but then coming back, you're actually able to be more flexible. Then you are able to accept an even higher percentage of what is coming out of the outsourcer. This is not to say that you shouldn't push back, that you shouldn't provide feedback, that you shouldn't refuse to accept unacceptable work. But if you can be hyper-specific on the front and then back up a little as things get delivered, you're going to find yourself being able to succeed with outsourcing a lot more easily. If you can't do that, if you can't draw that box, if you can't be clear on what delivery looks like, the other way to do outsourcing is through personnel, where you hire bodies, you hire people, and you give them work in much the same way that you give the other people on your team. This can work, and it isn't as uncommon as you might imagine, but it does have some disadvantages. Because you are interacting with another corporation who wants to make as much money as they can, they have a slight incentive to take longer than you might want them to in order to draw out as much money from you as possible. They obviously can't take this to the extreme because you'll never work with them again if they're being hyper slow. If they're costing you more than your internal devs, then they're not worth the money. But because you're usually outsourcing to relatively low cost centers, there's a lot of wiggle there before you're going to call them on it. When you are doing asset or feature level outsourcing, their incentive is to deliver things as quickly and as possible. And that can have its own problems because they're going to really want to argue that what they delivered meets the criteria and you need to pay them. So if you are used to doing a fairly high number of revisions, if you want to be able to provide a lot of feedback and have them be responsive to that feedback, an asset level agreement can actually be a problem. On the flip side, if you're paying them by the hour, then they're going to be very open to feedback. They'll love that because it's just more hours they get to bill you for. So both can work, and I've worked with both, and they've been successful. What I would argue is that in the case of asset level outsourcing, if you can define the asset clearly enough that it's got a very clear, deliver this hat, it should look like this piece of concept art, then you should do asset level outsourcing. If you are doing feature outsourcing and you can similarly draw a very tight box around your feature, then you should do feature level outsourcing. You should have a delivery based schedule. If you're doing asset based outsourcing and you can't make that really clear box, I would argue you're probably not ready to outsource that thing because the inefficiency of the feedback loop is probably going to drown out any benefits you're going to get from working with an outsourcer. If you're doing feature level outsourcing and you want to have that iterative loop, that is much more realistic because in that case, you're going to have a larger number of people working on a single thing. The cost of the feedback is going to be a much smaller percentage of the overall cost of everything that's going on. Let's talk about something that is currently in the media that it was very successful in their outsourcing, which is Clair Obscur Expedition 33. This was built by a very small team. I started to count the number of people in the credits, but then I realized that they actually repeated people's names based on the different jobs they did. Initial guess is that it's around 30, 35 people. And then they did fairly significant outsourcing. When I first started looking at the credits, I was actually expecting something much different than what they actually seem to have done. What this team seems to have done is done very targeted, very focused outsourcing. They have a team that did a bunch of their animation. They have a very large outsourced QA team. In fact, that team seems to be larger than the core team itself. They outsourced work on their performance and compatibility testing. They outsourced work for porting. They outsourced some work to do audio and music, localization, and then they have a publishing partner. But notice that they are doing very targeted outsourcing. They aren't outsourcing gameplay. They aren't outsourcing level art. In fact, it doesn't look like they outsourced art at all. I can't tell. It's certainly possible that they bought assets and that doesn't appear in the credits, but there are no 3D outsourcing houses in their credits. To me, what it looks like is they chose things that they were able to encapsulate very effectively. Because of the nature of their combat, the combat design and the combat animation aren't as tightly coupled as they are in a real-time game. So they are able to outsource combat animation, outsource gameplay animation, and have a wider acceptable range of what comes back. If they get back something that looks cool, they can make that work. Whereas in a real-time Twitch-based combat system, even though the animation might look cool, the design might not be able to integrate that. When they are outsourcing porting, very easy to specify what a successful port looks like. They may be going back and forth and iterating on controls, but if that control system is already locked down, which may be exactly what they did, they may have locked their controls down themselves and then worked with porting houses to make it go. If that's what they're doing, then success is very easy to articulate. It runs on this platform with this frame rate, with this resolution. And they're able to allow the partner to do whatever they need to do to check those checkboxes. With loc, with performance, they're able to have very binary or near binary success criteria. So what I was expecting to see when I looked at the credits for this game was Codev partners and entire teams building levels, but instead what I see is very focused, very clearly delineated areas of outsourcing, which is amazing, which would have allowed them to have a much greater degree of success with these partnerships, which allowed them to have that super tight team in the center of the game that everyone knew each other, everyone knew everyone's strengths and weaknesses, everyone was able to synergize together into a very cohesive unit. And then for the areas where they could, they brought in external partners where they were able to largely isolate them from the rest of the development. Is that actually what happened? I don't know. It's possible that these outsourcing partners were coming to stand-ups and were tightly integrated to the team. But looking at exactly what they were outsourcing, my belief is that's not what they were doing, is that the game team was very focused on building that core, and then they were grafting on the capabilities and the skill set and the specialization of these outsourcing partners. Something interesting that has happened over the last 15 years is there has been a massive consolidation amongst outsourcers. I want to say most, but in any case, a very large number of outsourcers are owned by a company called Keywords, who controls large swaths of outsourcing within art and animation. This does have some advantages. It means you probably already have a relationship with them. Therefore, you can ramp up dramatically if you need to, because they're actually potentially able to draw from several different studios to provide you the skill sets you're looking for. With that consolidation has come price increases. As they've gained a higher market share, they've been able to slowly dial their prices up. The other thing that I've been worried about as well is that it does put Keywords in potentially a bit of a power position at some point. If they suddenly decided that they wanted to be their own dev studio and they just took all of their outsourcers off the market, the entire video game industry would suddenly find itself without a large amount of the bandwidth that it's used to having, and would be scrambling to figure out how to fix that problem. One of the other things about outsourcing is you are hiding, I guess is the word, your crunch culture. There have been several reports from outsourcers in parts of Southeast Asia where their culture is horrifying, worse than anything at the worst in North America. But by offshoring it, the studios are able to ignore it to a large degree. They are able to pretend like it's not happening. They are able to get the benefits of these very bad work cultures. They're able to get the benefits of these very cheap locations, but they're able to avoid the consequences from the PR perspective of those bad labor practices. We're starting to see a little bit of awareness here, but I think to a large degree in video games, but also in a lot of things in the modern day. One of the corporate benefits of offshoring, of moving unpleasant things further away, is that most people are willing or at least able to largely ignore pretty bad things as long as they are far enough away from themselves. The relationship between your internal devs and your outsourcers is going to be weaker than the relationship between the devs on your team. They're going to interact with each other much less. There's going to be a certain degree of us versus them that develops. To some degree, maybe you want that because it, again, really drops your number of communication channels down. But it also can hurt your team cohesion because you have a team that's built up out of other teams. That us versus them also arises if your team is super big and sprawling, and arguably tightening down your central team to improve that team cohesion is probably a net benefit, but know that there will be either no relationship between your devs and the outsourcers, or a relationship that is going to be weaker or more strained than it would be between co-located members of a dev team. So what are you losing when you're outsourcing? Well, one of the big things is you are losing training because you're basically paying someone else to train their own people. When you hire juniors and you have them make the hats, then you are building up skills in those people. And while some of them are going to move on and go to other studios or leave the video game industry completely, hopefully some of them become your senior artists. And they're the ones that make your next dragon or spaceship or planet. When we outsource all of the easily critiqued, easily reproduced work, we're losing that opportunity to train up the people who will make the studio stronger, make the studio better. That said, maybe this isn't a skill set you're interested in growing within your studio. Maybe you've decided you're going to outsource your 3D props forever. And as a result, all you really need is someone who can provide the feedback and critique of the stuff that's coming back out of outsourcing. In that case, that loss of training, that loss of growing people doesn't matter because you're not looking to ever have that skill set, that capability within your studio. Forcing ourselves to get assets into a state that allows them to be outsourced can be a very beneficial thing to do. It forces us to think about things with a little bit more rigor. But having that relationship with our assets can, in some cases, reduce the amount of iteration that we're willing to do. And while I do think that some studios do more iteration than they should, if you put too much friction into the iteration process, you have the opposite problem, and you end up shipping your first idea, which often isn't the one you really want to ship. If we over-rely on outsourcing, we potentially put ourselves into that scenario where we are unwilling to make the changes that we need to make in order to make our game really good. Now, one way that to mitigate that, which is used by studios that do a lot of outsourcing, is you make a tiny version of the game in its totality. do whatever iteration that is necessary to do within that tiny box, and only start the outsourcing process once you understand that little box. It's a very different way to work than most studios work, but that does allow you to keep that iteration, keep that team cohesion, keep that communication bubble as small and tight as possible. And then once you see it, once you understand, then start the process of outsourcing more broadly. It isn't always going to be practical because some games have bigger feature sets, bigger asset collections than others. Not all games have that central core, or at least that central core isn't complete enough to then just imagine making 50 times that and calling that your game. If your game is this little circle, but then spread across the entirety of 50 hours, then this methodology works amazingly. If there's a lot of other stuff within that outer circle, it could still work, but know that you're going to have more stuff seep back in as you broaden your circle. You're going to make that central circle with walk around, swing a sword, and talk to people. And then as you realize that, oh wait, we also need dragon riding. Oh wait, we also need swimming. Oh wait. If you can, you want everything to really exist in that central circle before you can broaden it out, which isn't always going to be practical or possible. An alternative to this, which is what I think Sandfall is doing with Expedition 33, is rather than making that core be focused on a chunk of content, we're going to build this 2 hours of content and then replicate it across the game, is to focus that core on the core disciplines, on the core content that you want to care about. So in Expedition 33's case, I think they are focused on design and storytelling and level art and level design, and then allowing things like animation and perhaps music and porting and performance to live out in outsourced world. This might give you an angle to do this where you are still iterating a lot on your core gameplay loops where you are still changing things a lot. Because if you can separate some kinds of content from other kinds of content, you are able to potentially outsource that content, knowing that the changes in your core aren't going to invalidate that other content. Or at least that would be the hope. You might be fundamentally against outsourcing just from the get-go. You might feel like your studio should only hire people within itself, that everyone should be an employee and should be treated as such. And I definitely get that thinking. The reality is that AAA, at least, budgets have gotten really big. The number of assets has gotten really big. And the consequence of that has been a need to find outlets to provide some of those massive number of assets at a lower cost. You could argue that maybe they don't need all of that. And certainly I think that argument is available to be made. But know that if you are going to go the route of having no outsourcing, you are going to either become much more expensive or you're going to have less. I'm a big believer in small teams. I think that small teams are able to work much more efficiently than larger teams. So potentially the amount of less you're forced to accept might be acceptable. It might not be as big of a loss as you might first worry, but there'll be something. You are going to have to do less if you choose not to do outsourcing. So should you do outsourcing? Assuming you are open to the conversation at all, and make sure that you and your studio is before you go too far down this road. Assuming you are willing to explore this space, ask yourself these questions. Do you need a fairly large number of similar assets? Especially assets that you can clearly articulate, assets where you can clearly spell out what a successful delivery looks like. If the answer is yes, that's a good place to potentially look at an asset level outsourcing partner? Do you have an entire feature that needs a team on it, but that feature is largely self-contained and only peripherally touches the rest of the game? That's a great opportunity to find a Codev partner or another more turnkey outsourcing partner who can own that entire feature. Do you need a set of skills that you do not have, that you don't even know how to go about acquiring? Especially if that skill set is something you're only going to need for a relatively limited length of time. In that case, one of the hyper-specialized outsourcers that provide performance or other hyper-technical skills might be worth looking at. If all you're looking for is to add a designer or two, or add an artist or two, or add a programmer or two, then I question whether or not you are going to be happy with that outsourcing relationship. Because you aren't going to have a contract that is focused on delivery. You're basically just hiring someone in a very convoluted way, but their reporting structure is kind of a mess. You're paying a corporation a premium for an employee. In most cases, be better off looking for a way that you could hire that same skill set into your studio. Now, if you are going to turn around and fire that person in 6 months, then yes, you are better off looking to form a partnership with an outsourcer who can provide you short-term skills. But most of the time, you don't need someone for such a short period of time. If you're building your studio from the ground up, definitely don't discount the power that comes from having a very small, under 50-person core team that is able to gel to a much greater degree than a larger team is capable of. Outsourcing, if you build it into your studio planning in the early days, may be a way to allow you to keep that core really small and really tight. So if it's asset-based, if it's feature-based, if it's hyper-specialized skills, then I do think that outsourcing can be beneficial to your game. If it's just a way to guilt-free hire people at a much lower salary, then I would argue that's probably not the way to go. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon. So if you're interested in supporting the channel in that way, there will be a link to that in the description as well. Both patrons and channel members get access to our Discord. If you're looking to interact with the community of this channel to a deeper level, that's a great way to do it. If you are a game dev, have you worked with outsourcing? What are some of your best experiences? What are some of the ways that you think it's actually working out great? What are some of the horror stories that you've encountered? As someone who doesn't work in game dev, when you hear about outsourcing, what's your initial thoughts? Do you care? Is this just a bit of the sausage making that you're not interested in at all? Do you care about stories of worker mistreatment? Do you care about the discrepancy in between salaries between different locations? Let me know down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.